Sometimes the cause of radio interference is obvious, but more often than not, the unwanted presence of RF interference calls for more than just technical understanding. The sheer range of devices and equipment capable of generating RF in this modern age of power line adapters and cheap power supplies often causes problems beyond the competence of the average radio amateur, let alone Joe Public. So today we'll look at the organisation that tackled RF interference in the decades leading up to the 1970s and 80s. TV and radio was all RF oriented back then, and there wasn't as many TV channels and not nearly as many radio channels as there is today. So how did an inexperienced member of the public feel when faced with a television screen full of wavy lines or Radio 1 overlaid with a high-pitched whine? Where did they go to get expert advice, and how did they solve this problem? Well, often a television engineer could help, but what about those cases which didn't have an easy solution? Fortunately for them, the need for specialist advice in this field had been recognised for many decades before, and a highly skilled group of professionals known as the Radio Interference Service spent their working days attempting to ensure the uninterrupted reception of Coronation Street, Top of the Pops and the Archers. The RIS, not to be confused with the Radio Investigation Service, later had overall responsibility for ensuring the quality of nearly all forms of radio service. They were a department of British Telecom and primarily looked after the interests of the safety of life services. Transmissions by fire, police and ambulance services had to be free from interference for the protection of the community, whereas broadcast reception, designed basically for entertainment, was intended to be free of all major and prolonged forms of interference. As radio amateurs, it's easy to feel, especially nowadays, that we don't get the degree of service which we feel we perhaps deserve from Ofcom, and the same view was held decades ago about the RIS. But we have to bear in mind the sheer volume of radio traffic and the complexity of frequency allocation when wondering why the local squeaky has been allowed to operate for days, weeks, months and even years. The origins of the Radio Interference Service can be traced to the form of a gentleman's agreement made in 1922 between the BBC and the Postmaster General, when it was decided that the BBC would offer, within reason, the interference-free reception of broadcast signals because a licence fee was being charged. With domestic radio being in its infancy, the work involved was not all that great, and complaints were usually investigated by post office telephone or telegraph engineers working overtime. Often working either on foot or by public transport, which entailed carrying a box of tools in one hand and a receiver in the other, these gentlemen were often wireless enthusiasts who had gained their considerable experience with valves while working on amplifiers in telephone lines. Their most common problem in those days was noises from any other receiver in the vicinity, as well as early electrical devices such as vacuum cleaners, although the domestic main supply at that time was fairly uncommon. Most receivers were battery powered, and this in turn led to a fair degree of interference from the rotary converters then commonly used for charging the batteries. And so the situation continued until in 1932 it was decided that the growth in the number of complaints of interference warranted a full-time specialist service, manned by specially trained officers. Titled investigation officers, the first specialists began training in 1932 at Dollis Hill in London. By 1933, the service was being kitted out with the most up-to-date tracing equipment. They were no longer obliged to walk the streets in pursuit of an elusive signal. Specially adapted vans, many of which had non-metallic bodies to allow for internal aerials, were provided and soon earned the affectionate name Leaping Lena amongst their crews. By this time, public interest in broadcast reception was becoming widespread, and since this interest coincided with the dramatic growth in the use of mains electricity to power homes and factories, the number of interference complaints rose steadily. As well as their own tools and tracing equipment, the investigation officers carried a comprehensive stock of the most common suppression devices, which, though intended primarily for demonstration purposes, were available for sale to anyone whose equipment was found to be causing interference. Although it had been around for quite a few years by this time, amateur radio created very little work for the RIS officers. It wasn't necessary in those days to pass an exam to become a radio amateur. All you had to do was provide the names of 2 references and offer the Post Office Engineering Department a reasonable outline of the type of experiments you wished to conduct. All transmissions at this time were CW, and although the make and break effect of the key may have caused some initial interference, it was easily traced and just as easily remedied. All amateurs could expect an occasional visit from an RIS officer to ensure that their equipment at the station wasn't causing any problems. These visits were often an excuse for exchanging information and experience, since then, like now, many of the officers were amateurs themselves. The number of amateur licenses in use actually went down quite significantly in 1929. This was because from the 1st of January that year, it had been decided that frequency determination, previously a sort of inexact science, had to be achieved either by means of crystal-controlled transmitters or a crystal-controlled frequency meter. Since this demanded considerably more effort on the part of the licensee, many considered their interest not worth it, and it was a few years before the number of licenses increased again. The first experiments in transmitting television pictures started in 1929, but since the pictures themselves were small and the coverage area of the transmissions very limited, there was no great public interest in the idea, and it wasn't until the introduction of a new high-definition service in November of 1936 that the first trickle of complaints of TVI started to occur. Records for the years immediately before the war show an annual average of 40,000 complaints of BCI compared to only 100 complaints of TVI. Even this small number came to a sudden halt with the outbreak of war, when television transmissions were suspended. It was in the late 30s and 40s that the emergency services began to realise the potential of radio, and this led to a new direction for the RIS. Eddystone Radio had begun the development of VHF police radios by 1938, and London Police had been transmitting CW on 160 metres for some time, and both they and Lancashire Constabulary had been experimenting with simplex mobile systems. However, it was 1942 before even large cities like Birmingham had their first VHF systems for base-to-mobile communications using the 5-metre band. Since the introduction of this type of service, its protection from other forms of RF had been a primary duty of the RIS. It's also interesting to note that the development of police radio was almost entirely due to the efforts of radio amateurs themselves from within the various forces. The outbreak of World War II didn't really bring any excitement for the job of the RIS officers. They were responsible for a certain amount of listening, but their day-to-day wasn't spent chasing spies all over Dartmoor. For obvious reasons, the vast majority of this work fell to a military organisation called the Radio Security Service, and with the closure of the infant television service, the RAS worked to ensure the best possible reception of the BBC's home service, which had become for most people their major source of news. With the end of the war, RAS duties became more and more complex. TV transmissions were resumed in 1946 and their coverage area expanded. The war itself had ensured the future of broadcast radio, and by this time there can't have been many households without a receiver. Despite post-war austerity, an ever-increasing number of people had television sets. Also, the range of domestic electrical appliances was going up. Items such as refrigerators and thermostats gave rise to a number of interference complaints, and another common source of trouble was leakage from 11 kV overhead lines as well as transformers. So heavy was the post-war demand for technology that by the early 50s, the average annual number of interference complaints received by the post office had risen to 77,000 for sound broadcasting and 28,000 for television. The development of the radio services since the 50s had been staggering, and the increased demands on frequency allocation placed even greater demands on the RIS. By the 1970s and 80s, there was an ever-expanding land mobile radio system, television moved from VHF to UHF and colour, and with additional channels, the amount of spectrum it needed was dramatically increased. FM broadcasting, once thought of as totally unnecessary, became a fact of life, and the massive potential of radio as a navigational aid ensured that large chunks of the spectrum rated highly in terms of protection from interference. An ever-increasing public awareness of the value of communications made these demands more and more difficult to meet. Pirates, in one form or another, have been with us since the dawn of radio, and in the main, the RAS did a great deal to discourage them in the most constructive manner. Until the mid-70s, most pirates were known, usually by the local amateurs, and in most cases, a friendly warning was all that was required. The beginnings of CB created a few extra difficulties. The early 27 MHz enthusiasts might have remained undetected for considerably longer if they had been using modern radios. Nobody was listening to 27 MHz in those days, and it only came to the attention of the RAS as a result of complaints of interference from the medical services whose carrier-activated paging equipment fell within that band. It was soon established that their difficulties resulted from overmodulation of AM transmitters. The wealth of experience of specialists in this complex field was of immense value, and despite the fact that a visit might in some cases lead to the suspension of a licence, these men were welcomed eagerly into the homes of radio amateurs. Interference often occurred outside normal working hours, and even when the source was obvious, the cure may not be easy. RAS officers also had to be something of a diplomat. It wasn't an easy task to convince a viewer that his television set was behaving unreasonably, when it worked perfectly until his neighbour passed the RAE. By the 1980s, British Telecom no longer wanted the job of operating the radio interference service, and so the Department of Trade and Industry continued the role by establishing the Radio Investigation Service. I did make a video on the modern RIS, which I'll link at the end of this one, so you can pick up the story where we leave it here.